So yeah, I'm going to talk to you today about tracking in adapt, and tracking in adapt is currently provided by the Spoor extension, but there's also a bit of support from the bookmarking extension, and I'll come back to that shortly. And the main thing is it currently supports SCORM 1.2. It's got unofficial support for SCORM 2004. I'm not going to cover that today because we just don't have time, but if you go on to the Spoor plugin GitHub repo, there's some information on there if you want to kind of set up SCORM 2004 support. It is all perfectly possible. So, SCORM, a quick overview. So, shareable content object reference model. And from that you get also a shareable content object, which is the smallest element of e-learning, which we call a SCO. So you'll generally hear the term SCO used quite a lot to represent a chunk of e-learning as far as SCORM is concerned. What SCORM is it's a standard that defines two things: the content aggregation model, or how to package your content up, and the runtime environment, or how to get your content and the LMS to talk to each other. First of all, on packaging, basically it's all about this thing called the manifest file, which is a file called imsmanifest.xml. Let's just kind of dive in and have a quick look. So this is what your typical manifest file looks like. It is an XML document. It kind of looks complicated. Actually, the one in the adapt is pretty much the simplest version I could find to use that still works for pretty much everything. The key parts to it, really, it's quite simple. The main bit is down here, this list of stuff. So you've got your course title here and your launch page for the course, your path to the launch page. It's nice and simple. But just to go through some of the stuff in the rest of the file, I mean, other key bits that are important are, you can kind of see where their adapt underscore is written through the file. That's sort of important. What you're supposed to do in SCORM is make that some kind of unique identifier. So, I don't know, like a Kineo, every project gets a unique ID, so we kind of tend to stick that in there and just replace all of those instances of adapt underscore with some kind of ID that's unique to the project or that particular module. Not all LMSs are going to care if you don't do that, so it doesn't really matter if you leave it alone. Then you've got this chunk here, which is the metadata, so that just describes the course. Most LMSs don't really do anything for this, but you know, if you want to, you can kind of put in a title there and a brief description of the course there, which the LMS may or may not display. Then, as I mentioned before, you get down to this kind of key bit here. Now this looks a bit funny that there's two titles, and the reason for that is that SCORM allows for something called a multi-SCO package. So instead of having your menu within the course, you'd actually produce lots of much smaller learning objects. It's what it wants you to do, is create all these little learning objects and then bind them together in courses. The only downside of that is that the menu that the LMS presents is usually pretty shocking. Certainly it wouldn't be acceptable to any of our clients. So people tend not to really do multi-SCO courses. This guy here is your mastery score. So if you want, you can put a pass mark for the course in there. The reason this is commented out and the reason we don't do it is if you put it in there, the LMS then controls what the course status gets set to. And generally we don't really want that. We want to be able to control when the status changes to passed. For that reason, we generally comment that out, but it is there if you do find you need to use it. And then finally, these are the sort of list of resources. And what SCORM kind of wants you to do is list every single file in the course here. Don't bother. I think there was only one LMS ever that really required you to do it, and almost all of the others would throw a hissy fit if you got something even slightly wrong. So it generally just caused more problems than it's worth. So we pretty much only list, that's your launch page there, and just an entry for the launch page. And basically that is the most simple manifest file that I could come up with. As things kind of stand in adapt, until very recently you had to go in and fill out all of this information manually. You can see here this is the latest version, and it's actually pulling the information from the course itself. There's still a little bit more work to do on it to get it to generate an ID, a unique identifier automatically that it's going to keep the same every time you publish the course, but now it is a lot easier to deal with. The next part of packaging is something called the package interchange file. It's a zip file. The main thing, and this is probably kind of one of the most common errors people get with SCORM, is zipping the thing up incorrectly. So the important thing is when you open the zip file, the first thing you must see in there is the file imsmanifest.xml. If it's in a subfolder, you upload it to the LMS and the LMS goes, ugh. So the first thing that has to be in there is the manifest file, and it has some supporting files like .xsd files as well. Presumably they need to be in there as well. And tried doing it without. Doesn't matter where the rest of your content is, that can all be in a subfolder, so long as the path to the launch page in the manifest file is right, it's all going to be happy. The next part of it is the runtime environment, which I'm just going to refer to from now on as the API, because that's generally what everybody calls it. And what is the API and where do you find it? Basically, it's just a JavaScript object. It's a JavaScript object that the LMS will inject somewhere into the windows that make up the LMS in the course at the point the course is launched. So, your course's responsibility, the first thing it has to do is find this thing. So it has to do a little bit of a search around. Basically what it does is it starts up the find API function we use is quite a common one. It was produced years and years ago by some of the guys who actually kind of came up with SCORM, and it's an open source package that we take advantage of called the pipworks wrapper, and it's got a really good find function. Basically all that happens is the course window opens, it goes, is there an API object here? No, okay. Am I in a frame set? Yeah, okay, I'll search through all the frames. No, still haven't found it. Was I opened by am I a pop-up window? Was I opened by something else? Okay, I'll do exactly the same thing, but in the pop-up window. And then eventually, hopefully, it will find it. So this is the key bit, and this is kind of the first bit that you might get wrong, or that you might have a problem with. Not if you use adapt, because it's so good, and all the SCORM code in there is so robust that you'll never have any problems like this, ever. What's next? Well, you can start using some of the API functions. So I'll just quickly run through what these are. The first one, LMS initialize, pretty self-explanatory. You found your API. The first thing you have to do is you've got the course content. The course needs to tell the LMS that it's ready. And for some reason, I forget why, but lots of these functions you have to pass an empty string. So LMS initialize, basically I've now told the LMS I'm ready to go. Now this is a key bit here, is most of these function calls will return true or false to indicate whether they were successful or not. Obviously, if it returns false, you've got a problem, and you then need to go into your kind of debugging routine to find out why. So now that we're initialized, we can start getting and setting data. So there's two functions for that. There's getValue, which just asks for a single property, which is name, so the name of the field that you want to get, and setValue, which asks for the name and what you want it to set to. Next thing is kind of an important concept here, is LMS commit. So what happens when you're getting and setting all of this data is in most learning management systems, it's not going to be transferring the data back to the server. It's not going to be recording it in the database. It just saves it all in the browser in this kind of little JavaScript object. And the reason for that is obviously you can be setting enormous amounts of data constantly. You can have a lot of information going back and forth. If you were to try and save that information to the database every single time you changed it, you'd pretty quickly overload your server. If you've got thousands of users all on the same LMS, all doing thousands of courses, all of which are writing out, kind of every response to every question, your server will fall over pretty quickly. So what you do is you make lots and lots of get and set calls, and then at some point which you determine to be appropriate, you call LMS commit, and at that point the LMS will save all of the data back. So this is kind of a key thing to get right. You don't want to be doing this too often because you'll break the server, and you don't want to be doing it too infrequently because there's a risk that the browser could crash or the user could drop their network connection, and thereafter all that data that they've saved up until that point is going to be lost. So kind of getting a decent commit strategy is quite important in your course. And then finally, once you're done with your course and you're about to close it, you usually attach this function to the window close. You have to tell the LMS that it's finished. Some of the common data fields that you're going to use when working with these, so I've really just taken in kind of the core ones here. The first and most important is the lesson status. So when your course starts, it's the responsibility of the LMS to set this to not started. And then pretty much the first thing your course is going to do is look at that and go, right, I'm going to change that to incomplete to reflect that the user has now started the course. Interestingly, if you don't do that and then close the course down, the LMS should automatically just mark it as completed. It assumes you're going to create something called a dumb SCO, where you're not going to bother tracking, you don't care if there's any kind of completion criteria in the course. It'll just go, yeah, okay, they've done that, just looking at it was good enough. So that's kind of a quick way to just make a course set to completed immediately, is just don't change the status, and then the LMS is supposed to do it for you. So this data field, you can set it to one of 4 values. So incomplete, completed, passed, and failed. Strictly speaking, they should be all of those words. They should be all lowercase, and this is kind of where you get into various problems. So some LMSs will return the word completed with a capital C, even though they're not meant to. So there's lots of code in adapt to help work around all of that for you. So it will kind of translate things to lowercase and make sure there's no spaces on the end, and all kinds of things that some of the rather shoddy LMS developers have done over the years to try and break our beautiful courses and frustrate and annoy people like me. So the next one is the suspend data. This is kind of a big thing. This is a storage field that's made available for you to store the internal tracking state of your course. So basically you sort of remember how your course is, you dump all of that information in there, and then next time when the user launches the course again, the course can use that information to restore the course into the state it last was. So what kind of goes in here varies enormously from e-learning product to e-learning product. The key thing to know about this is that you're only allowed 4K of data in SCORM, which is not a lot really. In SCORM 2004 it's increased dramatically, and in xAPI, as far as I know, there's pretty much no limit. But at the moment the standard we work to is SCORM 1.2. The next one is the lesson location. So this is just for the course to store the bit of the course the user was last on, so that when they come back into it, it might be page 1. In ADAPT, it is the component ID or block ID or something like that, depending on how you've configured bookmarking. Then you've got your ability to store the score. And the key thing here is that each SCO can only have one score, so this can be quite frustrating for people, and obviously frustrating where you've got a course that's got multiple assessments in. You've got no real way of storing all of the different scores of the assessments in a way that could be reported on. So you can dump all of that data into the suspend data, but that's not really meant to be reported on. So, in this, what ADAPT does here, it aggregates, if you've got a multi-assessment course, it just aggregates all the assessment scores together and puts it in there. Session time is just the amount of time that the user has been in the course. I think a key thing with that is only to bother sending it at the point the course is closed, because the LMS will ignore all but the last one of that it gets. And then what the LMS is responsible for is adding that to all the other previous sessions, so that you then get a total time, so you can see the amount of time the user has been in the course for all time. And so interactions is for storing the user's responses to questions. And the key things with this, and one of the slightly annoying things about SCORM 1.2, is this is an optional field. So ADAPT does use CMI interactions when it's available, and it will check to see if it's supported before attempting to write to it. But yeah, it's kind of frustrating. In SCORM 2004 that all changed, and they basically said, oh, all of it has to be supported or you can't call yourselves SCORM compliant. That's kind of the introduction to SCORM generally. SCORM specifically in ADAPT. Spoor is mainly configured through config.json. There's various settings in here. There's an example.json. If you go to, as with all of the plugins, you can find an example.json that shows you all the different settings. But I think the key things here are these two guys: require course completed and require assessment passed. So what I've done in this course, I've set this up so that the user has to do everything in the course and pass the assessment in order to get the entire thing completed. So, it's really challenging. They've got to do everything. They can't just skip through and go right to the assessment and pass. They've got to meet both of those completion criteria that we call. I'm also going to submit the score back to the LMS because I actually want that to be recorded. This value here should store responses. This creates a lot of confusion. What this does is all of the user's responses to the questions will be restored next time you relaunch the course. So what that means is you go in, you answer all the questions, you quit, you come back, all of those questions will remain answered like you did last time. So that's really useful, particularly if you want to limit the amount of attempts a user has at an assessment, so they can't just quit and relaunch in order to reset it. It will remember what they did, and they won't be able to do that. And then you've got this, which is kind of a similar thing. So this is back to recording, the CMI interactions thing I mentioned earlier. This will record the user's responses to the CMI interactions data field. So that's kind of a reporting thing. The difference with that is, it's like, say I've got, I go to the course and I answer question 1 15 times, I'll get a record of all 15 of those answers. So it's a bit that's perhaps not used very much just because it's optional, but it is actually really powerful, I think, in e-learning, because you can look at the data that you get from that, and if people are answering the same question wrong over and over, you can maybe look at your course and examine what it is about the course that means they're unable to answer that question. Is it worded poorly? Something like that. So I think that's very useful. Then into the reporting section, I talked about the lesson status here earlier. So this is basically once these completion criteria are met, what you actually want the lesson status to be set to. So completed is generally very common. There are some learning management systems that require it to be passed in order for the course to actually be flagged as completed. So you can adjust all those settings here. And then again here, if you fail the assessment, do you want to leave the status as incomplete, or do you actually want to mark it as failed? Because again, that can be very different on different LMSs. It can trigger quite different behaviour. So as I mentioned, bookmarking is done as a separate extension because You may want to use it, you may not. It's got a whole kind of UI part to it as well. So it uses the Spoor extension in order to store the data, but it's actually a completely separate thing. You can turn it on here or not. So bookmarking often is confused with the kind of act of remembering everything in the course, the kind of tracking of the internal state, but it's not. It's really a separate thing. So it's all about returning the user to the last page that they were on. So as you know, when you've got bookmarking enabled, as you move through the course, the way it's set up here is as you go from block to block, the block ID that you're on currently will be written out to the LMS, and so then when you quit, it's going to remember that, and then when you come back, you get the option to go back there, so that you can just continue where you left off, and obviously you can configure the messages and stuff like that. Tracking IDs are a very key part of ADAPT. In the authoring tool, the IDs that the authoring tool generates can be very lengthy. I think they're like 14 characters or something like that. So you don't, as I mentioned before, we've got very limited storage space. So we don't want to go writing all of those out to the suspend data because we really quickly run out of space. So what we do instead is we have these tracking IDs, and each block is assigned a tracking ID, which is just a number, and so it uses those to store them instead. So a really key part of making sure your course is going to track correctly is ensuring that the tracking IDs are set correctly. And there's actually some functionality in the framework. I mean, you can just set them manually, but obviously then you can really easily end up with, you know, accidentally duplicating them, getting them out of order, missing one out, stuff like that. So there's actually some tasks in the ADAPT command line interface. There's a reset tracking ID and an insert tracking ID. So what I advise you do is you just get your course structure set up, and then once you've done that, just run the insert tracking ID or reset tracking ID command. It'll put all those in there for you, and you're not going to go far wrong. Okay, so obviously you've kind of seen that SCORM, whilst it's very, very well accepted and widely used and widely supported, it's kind of limiting. There are far more limitations than I've even attempted to talk about today. I think one of the most significant ones, other than the amount of data that you can track, the kind of data that you can track, is also where your content has to be. So it has to sit on the same server as the learning management system. This is because everything is done in JavaScript. The way it's done through this JavaScript API, you've got browser security that means that the two things have to be on the same server within the same, even the same subdomain and the same port number, or the JavaScript won't allow the two things to talk to each other. So one of the things that xAPI does is allow content to become separate and to sit somewhere else and to track lots more. So it's hugely more expansive. It's also kind of, as a result, much more complicated. It's like going from, you know, having a bath to suddenly being in this ocean. And I think one of the things we've discovered looking at it is, at the moment, we're just kind of coming across lots of obstacles. We're like, well, okay, you know, because we're trying to solve the problem for everybody, not just for one course. We want to make something for ADAPT that's going to work for all of you, and that's really challenging. So, I mean, some of the things we've run into, there's a problem with authentication, for example. So the xAPI doesn't really specify anything about authentication. SCORM doesn't either, but since you launched everything from a learning management system, which has got user management built in, you know that the user's authenticated. You know, they can't launch the content outside of the LMS because SCORM doesn't allow for that. So how do you solve that problem in xAPI? How do you ensure that the user's authenticated? Are we going to have to start putting login forms into courses? Hard coding user details into the course config? That sounds a bit risky. And then there's the kind of openness of the data as well. So the xAPI standard, I think, is very, very open. So it's all like, yeah, there's data here, we want to use it and share it. But we're working with clients in the banking sector, and they don't want that. They would go absolutely crazy if one user could see another user's data. So making sure everything's locked down is another challenge as well. So, you know, some learning record stores will deal with that. Others haven't really addressed that at all. So those are kind of the things that we're looking at the moment. I think really the way forward, and I do see 2017 as being the year of xAPI for ADAPT. So I think last year we really focused on multi-language, and what I've learned, I think, from working on a distributed open source project is that getting these big pieces of work done can actually be quite challenging, because you've got people who aren't necessarily on the project full time, they're donating their time, so it's hard to get someone to have a good run at things. So really focusing on one of these things at a time is the best way forward, and this year I really want it to be xAPI.
Let's thank Matt for sharing his experience.
Sorry, it was a bit rushed.